So I'm going to move between two screen interfaces because I have your abstracts on my mobile phone because they came in today. And I'll just read out a little bit about what I've been feeling the last few days, maybe perhaps the last few weeks, in fact. But let me first express my warm greetings to everyone here in the room. Mamta, Meera, the entire team of the Anant Curatorial Forum, including the technical facilitators, and the people who have fueled our coffee breaks and fed us great food. Thank you very much. I'm not going to read out my abstract, as it is available to you already, except to pick on a line, where I evoke the idea of invisible flows that can redirect our perceptions of the world. This line was meant to underscore the role that curators play to visibilize and contextualize aesthetic practices that oftentimes are marginalized or erased, to prop up existing structures of power, and the kind of interventions that our panelists have made in their role as curators and museum professionals to disrupt these narratives. However, this morning, the term invisible currents has taken on another layer. We woke up today to the terrifying news that the ongoing war in our neighborhood, a conflagration that has been repeatedly evoked since yesterday, has taken another turn wherein the possibility of a nuclear radiation leak has compounded the dangerous situation that the world finds itself in. While yesterday, the altered flight paths of aircrafts and oil and gas reserves that lie in the subterranean depths of the earth were referenced to call attention to the colonizing impulses of suprematist regimes that threaten the world with their insatiable hunger for power, star-studded skies and free flight of birds and the swirl of dust storms were evoked to suggest the possibility of another kind of a world in the future. Yet, we know that oil spills and slicks, the smoke of burning gas fields, and yes, radiation will make this planet unlivable for even those power brokers who have built bunkers for their own safety and stockpiled potassium iodide pills to survive nuclear holocaust. However, we also know that the fallout of this madness will affect the most vulnerable on this planet the most. With hospitals being bombed into oblivion and the indiscriminate carpet bombing of civilian habitats brings misery to the immediate victims of this violence, the ongoing war also affects livelihoods of millions that live thousands of miles away. The war economy will, however, also line the pockets of the wealthy as artificial intelligence companies, missile manufacturers, pharmaceutical giants, and building contractors will make millions in profits, and they will look to culture and art as a means to build an alternative perception of their dealings. The art world may eventually profit immensely from the fallout of this war, as an oil spill on canvas is so much more a store of value than a barrel of oil that will be consumed in a matter of minutes. I, though, would like to move on from my ruminations on the ongoing war to draw attention to the immediate of the here and the now, and the decolonial undercurrents that manifest themselves when bodies come together in public acts of resistance against domination instead of retreating into the domain of privacy. In India, where the vast majority of lives are lived with no access to privacy, sleeping, making love, fornicating, cooking, eating, defecating, studying, protesting, laughing, and resisting in the public, on the streets, surrounded by surveillance cameras and biometric devices, and in the crowded dwellings of multi-generational homes, resistance is a form of placemaking that more often than not is the lot of those who live on the margins of society. In public universities, which is where I have spent my entire life as an academic and an arts organizer, acts of resistance to abuse of power is a democratic right that is routinely exercised by various unions of students, teachers, and workers. Forms that have led to multiple changes and acts of learning that people in positions of power are forced to acknowledge. However, under the current political dispensation, this form of resistance is under attack in ways that were unconceivable even a few years ago. On February 26th, less than a month ago, more than 40 students of the Jawaharlal Nehru University were detained by police. 6 of them were students of the School of Arts and Aesthetics, which is where I teach. They will be your future colleagues and perhaps collaborators. They were arrested when attempting to march to the Ministry of Education to demand the resignation of the university's vice chancellor for her racist worldview, aired on a podcast of the Sunday Guardian, where she claimed that Dalit and black communities were manufacturing their victimhood. What followed during the protest was a massive police crackdown on students who were carrying aloft placards with photographs of Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, the architect of India's constitution, and a significant force in navigating a future for Dalit communities through enactment of policies that were aimed at dismantling caste hierarchies of a majoritarian Hindutva imagination. The subsequent desecration of a photograph that was captured on camera of Dr. Ambedkar, that was captured on camera and widely circulated, arousing widespread anger before the government had it removed from social media platforms, is a telling point. So what is on the screen that you see now is an enlarged image of the policeman grinning from ear to ear in the seconds that followed the desecration of Dr. Ambedkar's photograph. And you can see that he's actually grinning. He's right there in the center. He's grinning, and he's just desecrated this photograph of Dr. Ambedkar. I leave you with this image to stress on the fact that though we may think of decolonial currents as acts of agency, we need to remain ever alert to forces that will reassert abusive power through all kinds of forces of repression, economic, sheer physical power, and of course forms of cancellation that further marginalize those who speak truth to power. And with those opening remarks, I'd like to now introduce the 2 speakers who are going to be on the panel. We have first Anish Gawande, and I'm just going to read out a little bit from the abstract because I just got it this morning. So he's going to actually be speaking about an exhibition he curated, Event Memory Metaphor. This was for a gallery, Tark, in Bombay in 2021. It's a curatorial intervention that resulted from years of resistance by the LGBT community against Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which dates back to the colonial period, that criminalized sexual acts against the order of nature, which also included consensual same-sex. So this project really is a remuneration on that. He'll also discusses 10 years of curatorial practice in other contexts. And Suheyla will present on her curatorial practice at the Barjeel Art Foundation in Sharjah. She will reflect on processes of decolonization of modern art histories of North Africa and West Asia by drawing attention to marginalized histories, to question the art historical canon that was formed during the Pan-Arabism movement that laid claim to a singular past. So with that, I invite Anish to speak first, and then Suheyla, so that we can move directly into the discussion.
Thank you so much to the Anant Curatorial Forum for being a space for difficult ideas to be discussed. I still remember the last one where I showed up in running shorts and a t-shirt, much to the dismay of Meera, but I'm glad to be here now, better dressed. Apologies, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm a pen and paper man, and I slept on my paper the last night, which is why my kurta is stained today. What I'm about to present today is a thesis I have been working on for the better part of the last decade, which is on decoloniality, materiality, and the allure of perfect pasts. Now, I say this in a challenging context for our country today. Yesterday, in Uttamnagar, which lies about 40 minutes west from here, a very, very tenuous Eid was celebrated. because calls were made to celebrate a Holi filled with blood this Eid, after communal tensions flared up after the death of a young man 2 weeks ago. At the same time, as I make my statement here, friends like Umar Khalid continue to remain in jail for acts that are considered anti-national, for acts that are considered to be seditious. As I speak here today, there are men who are being arrested for eating chicken on boats on the Ganga and then charged for kidnapping or commandeering a vehicle when it is found that eating chicken on boats is not a crime. As I stand here today, we have multiple reports of people getting lynched for eating beef, for loving somebody of their own gender, for daring to defy the state as it stands today. The challenge in all of these cases is that despite the gatherings that we have here today, these actions are justified using a language of decoloniality. To quote leading public intellectual Kangana Ranaut, who not too long ago commented, she's a famous Bollywood actress for some of you who may not be aware, who's now become a member of parliament. But Kangana Ranaut a few years ago said that India actually only got azadi or freedom in 2014, after the Narendra Modi-led government was voted to power in India. What does that mean? And we really must interrogate what these statements mean instead of dismissing them outright. It means that the political imagination of Hindutva considers the Brits to be invaders, considers the anti-colonial struggle to be one that was important to fight against, in some ways also acknowledges the Congress for fighting that anti-colonial struggle, but goes one step further. It makes the assumption and the logical assertion within its infrastructure that before the British came the Mughals. And the Mughals were just as colonial as the British were. And therefore the project of decolonization started by the Congress Party is one that is being continued by the state today in its attempts to unwork Mughal, or let's put it quite blatantly, Muslim influences on this country. Now the logic for this is fairly simple, right? It is a decolonial logic. It's come out of a logic that we ourselves have participated in, where we have said that colonization is responsible for several of the wicked problems that we see across the country today, from famines that continue to exist, to poverty, to the sort of infrastructures of bureaucracy that we struggle to sort of overturn. It's also because it allows us, this language of decoloniality allows us in some ways to blame Muslims for other wicked problems, right? For the lack of communal harmony, which has remained a constant both under the British Raj and today. For the lack of development or vikas, which has been taken away because Muslims have too many children and therefore take our HDI back. And for the continued inability of the state to be able to succeed despite the government's best intentions. And this is precisely where the logic of decoloniality comes in, right? The decoloniality logic says that unless a colony becomes free, regardless of how well-intentioned efforts are to progress and to develop, those efforts are bound to fail because you remain a colonial power. And the framing of the current state that we're in as a state of colonization, of an ideological colonization, that requires in some ways the unworking of these Islamic influences. And I point here to some of the works by Savarkar, who writes very eloquently, in fact, on how the language, the Sanskrit language, has been defiled by Islamic influences and become Hindi, and which is why we should support Marathi, but also of Golwalkar, the ideologue of the RSS, who speaks about this quite clearly in his sort of exhortation to go back to a glorious Hindu past. We must understand that it is the logic of coloniality that powers the state as we see it today. This return to a glorious past, this Make India Great Again project, is not one that is entirely born out of the right wing. If you go back to Nehru and you see Discovery of India, it attempts something very similar. In Discovery of India, Nehru invents an imagined perfect pre-colonial past where all of us live in harmony. The British, in that imagination, are the sole cause of our problems. Caste is erased, religious tensions are erased. The Indian National Congress is presented as the liberator of the oppressed communities, while completely sidelining its own role in the sort of suppression of minorities, from caste minorities to religious minorities to gender and sexual minorities, while it was very much in power in a shared way under the British Raj. So this project of a return to a fabled past, to a perfect past, the unworking of colonial experiments, the unworking of colonial logics, is one that Nehru embarks upon in some ways. It's a work that is in some ways carried on by the state as we see it today. It's a logic that has been very useful in the crafting of national identity. It's also been very useful to some of our struggles as we move through a contested political terrain where we fight for rights. The LGBTQ plus community in India, all the way back in the early 2000s, decided very consciously to say that Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which was a law that prohibited in its very Victorian morality carnal intercourse against the order of nature, which primarily restricted gay sex, was a Victorian-era law, a colonial hangover. Our opposition to that law was framed as an anti-colonial act. In fact, in 2018, when that law was finally sort of read down by the Supreme Court of India, in some ways, we repeated Kangana Ranaut's logic and said that was a day for queer azadi, for queer liberation, and that was the day when queer liberation had finally arrived in India, as if the Victorian-era law was the only one keeping us back, as if this glorified tale of a glorious Hindu past where the Kama Sutra allowed us all to have sex with each other was not also a past where women had to die on funeral pyres as part of sati, was not also a past where intercaste marriages were punished with mob lynchings, was not also a past where your ability to love was dictated by the social capital you were endowed with or one that you had acquired, right? So I want to place this in the context that these decolonial logics, these decolonial rhetorics that we use, often very productively, often very justifiably, are also logics that take a life of their own and can, in many ways, be misused, often by the same majoritarian regimes that we seek to use them against in the first place. This is not a crisis that is new. Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, who was the architect of India's constitution and one of our foremost legal but also socio-political thinkers, warned precisely against this. Accused at many times of being a collaborator with the British, sidelined by the Indian National Congress for being too soft on the British and for supporting the British in some ways. Many of you may recall the Bhima Koregaon monument, which stands in Maharashtra, in my home state, which is a monument to the Mahar army, which fought alongside the British, a Dalit, a caste-oppressed minority that fought alongside the British against, in some ways, Indian forces, that is celebrated much to the sort of consternation of the Hindutva regime that stands today, which led to many people getting arrested. But those imaginations of a past wherein the Dalits could collaborate with the British against a caste sort of system that oppressed them far more vehemently and vociferously than the British could, that imagination has continuously been stifled by the Indian state in the language of decoloniality, in the language of a return to a glorious past, in the portrayal of the British as enemy number one, right? In this Make India Great Again project. It's also, of course, a logic that people even before Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar have fought against. Someone like Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, who became the first king from a sort of Shudra community to become king and was actually refused a coronation because of his caste identity, was somebody who fought against the perils of caste as much as he fought against the Mughals. Somebody like Mahatma Jyotiba Phule, who was pioneered along with his wife Savitribai Phule for setting up education for oppressed castes across the country, but primarily across Maharashtra, was somebody who spoke out about the ills of sort of the caste system as much as of colonization and actively resisted an attempt to go back to the past or to forge some kind of perfect synthesis, and instead advocated for reform and the creation of a Satyashodhak Samaj, or the truth seekers society or grouping that had its own marriage rituals, that sort of reworked the tenuous relationships that existed between religion and caste in the decades that came previously. How do we now understand this conundrum that we're faced with, right? I think part of the way I understood it when I curated a show for Hena Kapadia at Tark titled Event Memory Metaphor was by expressing this discomfort, which seems to have seeped in. I know many of you run institutions here across the world. I know many of you are artists here and run institutions here. But there is a discomfort I have, particularly as somebody who studied in the US and then in the UK, with this fabled sort of pre-colonial past, this essential pre-colonial perfect past that is represented in institutions across the world. The pre-colonial, out of some notion of colonial guilt, is always presumed to be perfect, is not critiqued, is hesitatingly criticized. We risk going in to a very tricky domain of cultural essentialism when we refuse to criticize the past that rises and lies in these institutions today. We do great disservice to the very logics of decoloniality that we aim to put forward if we simply presume that what happened before colonization was something that was perfect and pure. In Event Memory Metaphor, I turned to a book by Shahid Amin, an incredible historian and theorist who wrote about the Chauri Chaura incident here in India, in which Mahatma Gandhi called off a protest because of tales of violence that emerged. And Amin, in many ways, turns to that site as a symbol of the precarity of memory, right? And about this idea that propels his narrative, which is that we don't really know what happened in Chauri Chaura. We have created a narrative around Chauri Chaura that allows us to paint Gandhi in a great light as somebody who called off a protest because of violence. But the very story that lies at the heart of that great narrative that we've constructed of a past of resistance rings hollow when interrogated further. It also drove, in some parts, from Anjali Arundekar's work. Anjali Arundekar is a professor in the University of California, and she works on the archive very extensively. And she has a powerful, powerful book called For the Record, which deals with India's tryst with sexuality as a form of recuperative hermeneutics, as a search for truth in the past that is always misguided, as a sort of yearning for some lost piece of the archive, a sort of almost Freudian imagination of figuring out what went wrong in your childhood, but make your childhood the past in terms of a country that will yield solutions to the future, right? This hunting for the past, we're obsessed. This is precisely what happened. This is how a civilization responded to this. We're very excited. We take on an almost archaeological form. But that logic is a logic of excavation, right? And it's precisely this logic of excavation that seeks to recover the past that powers the AI models that we see around us, that seek to convert everything that is visible to us into data that can be extracted and mined, that seeks to record all of our artworks through meta glasses, and that seeks to sort of put into Google culture all of the books that have been published before, only so that they can be mined to fuel algorithms in an extractive process. This idea of turning to a past as an extractive process is what I tried in some ways to argue against. It wasn't easy, I will tell you this, I'm not a very good curator, I can yap a lot, but my experience in the art world is that of somebody who comes to art from literature, right, and from theory. And so the assemblage, which is a form that I'm most familiar with compared to a well-curated show that has a thesis, the assemblage put forward was a series of provocations, right? There was Saju Kunhan's work, and Saju does incredibly powerful work about going to his ancestral homeland and finding pieces of tiles that he recovers. We don't know what those tiles were used for. We don't have context for them. The invitation is to imagine context into that space, right? Is not to celebrate unassumingly. With Samir Kulavur, we showed a work on Shaheen Bagh. This was right as the CA-NRC protests were taking place. This was a question of public memory, how an incident that the state tries to erase is preserved and recovered as historical record, particularly when we recognize that the archives that we create today will be the basis upon which future generations imagine the world that we lived in. So our duty is not only to ourselves, but to the future. And so what kind of world do we document with its own complexities determines how we get seen in the future. We had Ariz Katki going back to embroidery and his grandmother and the sort of little bags that were carried by him, by his grandfather with a bottle of wine sometimes and some groceries, that are a reminder that this search for decoloniality often focuses on the grand, not the mundane, focuses on great achievements, temples built, monuments constructed, wars won, battles fought, but not conversations had. Not neighborhoods lost, neighborhoods that continue to be lost today in Beirut and Tehran and Gaza and most certainly in Isfahan, a city that I hold very dear to my heart. We also had Parag Tandel, who sort of approaches this from a different perspective through food and combines his artistic practice with tales of food from the Koli community that is going to get lost in the face of ecological destruction, and imagines a counter-archive, one that doesn't necessarily hold the same weight that an archive that occupies space in a museum might. Perfect. And Ra Naqvi, and this was the work that I took from my own show, who has a kalamkari painting of the sacrifice of Ishmael. And this is beautiful because it's a reimagination of that archive. Ra is, of course, a trans queer artist from a sort of Muslim family who's now, if I'm not wrong, still based in Amsterdam or somewhere around. And they reinvent the kalamkari tradition, which is a tradition that is ostensibly Hindu, to reimagine the sacrifice of Abraham, which is in some ways a foundational sacrifice of sorts that my favorite poet, Agha Shahid Ali, speaks of a fair bit in his poem Ishmael, but also leading sort of Jewish writers like Shava Rosenfarb speak about when she writes from the Lord's Ghetto as this sort of recurrent motif that comes back time and again to haunt our collective consciousness. And Ra, in going back to that tradition, reimagines in some ways what the past can hold, not a truth-telling, not an authentic representation of what was, but in some ways a provocation into what can be. And perhaps to me it is the provocation of what can be that art offers today and a curatorial practice that might develop offers in the years to come. I'm very excited to hear Suheyla because her Pan-Arabism presentation resonates a lot with my own work, which has powered alternatives to this kind of imagination. A kind of Pan-Africanism that was espoused by Senghor and Aimé Césaire and leading thinkers of their time, from Senegal to the French Caribbean to sub-Saharan Africa, which was arguing for a kind of political imagination that was expansive, a return to the past that was not reductive. In fact, Senghor says French is as much an African language as it is a continental European one, and argues for the vertebration of oral languages using the sort of grammatical strength that French has, imagines these syncretic futures where colonization is not a period blocked off that needs to be discarded or disowned in its entirety, but reckoned with in some ways in the same way we reckon with other historical moments. Because in many ways, the essentialization of the colonial, the sort of exceptionalization of the colonial, is more often than not as dangerous as the processes of decolonization that emerge from it. Thank you very, very much.
So thank you very much for those presentations. And Anish, I know in some sense your earlier work, perhaps in the field of literature, speaks to the kind of work that Suheyla has been doing. Her focus has, of course, been on the Arab world and North Africa, whereas your work in the space of literature has been on sub-Saharan Africa and
West Africa,
right? So
so let me just begin with you, because when you think of the figure of Leopold Senghor and the kind of work that Elizabeth Harney has done on the Dhaka Biennale and its inception and the kind of platform it created for Pan-African art practices, she also points to the fact that Senghor himself came from an elite family, and interestingly enough, that many of the marginalized communities who were also in some sense epidermally not different were also organized along caste lines. And she actually uses the word caste to talk about how communities were divided based on profession. And so when the Pan-African movement takes the kind of form that it does, there are certain kinds of essentializations that also happen in the kind of curatorial projects that are undertaken, and I think in some sense Suheyla is addressing the same in the Pan-Arab movement, where voices of communities on the margins were not part of the canon in terms of the kind of works that they produced. Some thoughts on that?
Let me lead with an example. So you're very right. For those of you clued into the politics of Pan-Africanism in Senegal, Senghor remains a very, very divisive figure, right? He's the first poet president of Senegal, comes from an affluent family, is one of the first to go to France and become a civil servant, is also somebody who is the first person admitted into the Académie Française, and therefore part of the social and cultural milieu in some ways of the oppressor, but also a religious minority as a Christian in a majority Muslim country, and a linguistic minority in Senegal as a speaker of Pulaar rather than Wolof, right? So it's a very, in the lion, I like the lion and the hunter example. We are in some ways always the hunter and the hunted, right, in the identities that we carry with us. I think the ways to navigate those differences were quite remarkable. So in the 1960s, you had Sembène Ousmane Sembène, depending upon how you want to use his word and in which language, creating a film called Chedo. And Chedo was the tale of an African princess who was killed by the Maroiding Muslims, right? Sembène is a communist, but also Muslim, arguing for a past that rejects Islam as much as it rejects sort of French colonization. He's launching this film in a newly independent Senegal that has religious tensions that are very, very important to consider. He launches it in a Senegal where Senghor, as a Christian president, is backed by the most conservative Muslim voices in the country, the sort of clergy who would recoil at the sight of this film being launched. But in a strange way, the reason the film is banned is not because it is anti-Islam, it is not because it is a political ideology that one does not agree with, but on account of its spelling. So there's a huge debate that takes place with Pathe Diagne and others sort of writing op-eds in leading dailies saying that no, it should be CEDDO or not CEDO, and Sembène thinks it should be DO. Senghor thinks it should be, Sembène thinks it should be CEDDO, Senghor thinks it should be CEDO, and my thesis was actually called One D Too Many. A very cheeky sort of addressing of those differences, but it's a debate around how we turn to the past to understand the differences we have with respect to language. And so to acknowledge that decoloniality is a contested process, to acknowledge that decoloniality takes multiple ways, shapes, and forms, and to acknowledge that the proponents of decoloniality themselves may be propagating a form of coloniality that you are also against, is something that I think Pan-Africanism can teach us, that kind of textured layering and nuance which we seem to have lost today.
Thank you for that. And Suheyla, when I was listening to you and I was thinking about the way Indian modernism has been received or has been contextualized by Western institutions of art history and the museum, some of the things that you were raising ring true of how, modernisms elsewhere were also read and seen and perceived. So in framing the kind of institutions that you are framing now in the Arab world and are participating in curatorial projects, the museum in some sense is a colonial form, and the forms of display that are used or mobilized to narrate these histories are also from the colonial period. So how do you actually then create other kinds of interfaces? Are there possibilities of creating other kinds of interfaces, or do you think this as a kind of a useful model to work with? And what kind of publics would come into these kind of spaces? Do you work towards engaging with publics in different ways?
Yes, thank you, Shukla. And I would even go a little further and say that not only is the museum kind of as a structure, a colonial invention, but also, I mean, until today, many of the specialists, including myself, working on regional histories and with regional collections, are receiving their education in European or North American institutions. And so the kind of frameworks and terminology and language that we inherit is also very specific and was tailored for a particular kind of telling of history. And so when we come back to our respective regions and begin looking at art and collections and objects, and we are oftentimes faced with this crisis of terminology of how do we organize what is in front of us? What do we call it? What questions do we ask of it? And so I think this is in many ways a cue to slow down and to actually begin, from the objects outwards rather than the opposite of, bringing in a big box and trying to push things into those neat boxes. So that's one way. But I think, you make an excellent point in that it also calls for different kinds of engagements with audiences and even the writings of histories, which is why we've been increasingly kind of exploring different ways of writing histories or addressing histories in our publications. And this is also the case with the publication that will be shortly coming out on the collaboration with the Jahangir Nicholson Foundation, where it's not only art historical scholarly articles, similar to the ones you could find in peer-reviewed journals, but there are also family stories and fiction and conversation pieces, so other ways of telling stories. And I think also an important kind of area to look at, in how we frame the objects themselves is, there's this conception in a lot of art historical narratives and frameworks that art is something that is produced individually. It is something that does not, carry functional purpose and so on. And so when there's collective thought about, with producing an object, it's kind of relegated to community work or craft or, these kind of conceptions that are seen in many ways like inferior to the elevated fine art. And so with the Brazil collection, we've also began experimenting a little bit in what kind of objects do we collect. So we've began introducing carpets, and where, typically they would be attributed to the weavers of a particular center. We make sure to attribute them to the specific weavers who worked on them. So, the women, mostly women, who actually kind of design and make them physically. Things like ceramic tiles and glasswork and things that might be kind of relegated to a set of objects that are not kind of deserving enough to be in a museum space. So that's also one way to expand these conversations and see what can constitute modernity.
So thank you for that, and we don't have much time, but I think I'd like to take questions from the audience, and I'm sure there are many. There are several at the back. Okay. Anita, yeah, go ahead. They'll come back here.
I just want to share a memory around the same questions that we were speaking about, around colonial modernity, around the right-wing project of decolonization, and about language. During the time of the Rath Yatra, I was in my grandfather's village in UP, it's Mainpuri, and somebody had died in the family, and we as kids were in the house in Mainpuri, in this village, for about 13 days during that period when every morning the newspaper used to come, and on the a local newspaper, and on the front page of the newspaper was propaganda, BJP propaganda, right-wing propaganda, but in the language of the Chaupai of the Ramayana. Now that was actually, it really at that time shook me that the structure, so it was nothing to do with the actual Chaupai, but using the structure of the Chaupai to speak about the right-wing agenda. And I was really struck by the fact that why is it that cultural practitioners are dissociated from sources, that to counter this narrative that we are unable to create languages and speak in a way which is affective, because that is affective. I mean, I remember in the courtyard of the family, people reading that and enjoying that and laughing, and therefore, the ground has been prepared over through such methodologies. So this is, for me, a memory that actually still remains, and it's triggered by your presentation. Thank you.
Can I quickly respond to that? I want to just add a provocation to what you've said as well, right? I think the allure, going off of what Suheyla said also, is that if the Western terminology doesn't fit, let's go back to an ancient one. That's not the only alternative we have. I don't want to go back to some Hindu terminology, ghanta. Right? So I think what we've forgotten now, the worry I find ourselves in, including in curatorial practices, is we go back to some of these terminologies, whereas you've been part of creating new terminologies with fellow artists, right? I don't see that happening now, where we can imagine new terminologies that are also effective. And I feel like somewhere in this decoloniality, coloniality praxis, we've forgotten a process of reimagination that gets thrown to the wayside because we're too busy digging up the past to realistically and powerfully think of the future.
What I'm indicating is not the return to the past. What I'm saying is the usage of, the absolutely usage of musical forms or linguistic forms and totally subverting them, and because as an affective strategy. So this is something I've been mulling in my, and I'm just offering it to the,
There are two other questions here, one from Annapurna and one from Sabi, so if somebody can give them the mic. Are there more questions at the back? Maybe we can, there's one there, or a couple over there as well, okay.
So a few years ago, Tara Books published a book about the meaning of the museum to the various artists that come from the vernacular world that they publish frequently. And what came out in that book was that the museum was part of their modern lineage, that many of them understood themselves as people with ideas and languages because the museum gave them that space. And they negotiated strongly with the museum. For example, when Baju Sham saw in the tribal museum in Bhopal somebody putting an instrument, I think it's called a kanskar, or I forgot the name, it's just flown out of my head, I'm so sorry. On the floor, they said, you can't put that on the floor, that's sacred. So then a table was put forward for it. And these kinds of questions are negotiated, and a forum like the museum allows for such negotiations because it has a mandate to be public, however broken that mandate might be.
So that was more like a comment. Suheyla, do you have something to say to that? Or should we take that as a comment? Okay. Yeah, Sabi, go ahead.
So this is also a question to Suheyla. And picking up from, I think, what Anish was sort of getting at is we need to de-essentialize the term colonial and I guess by way of that also decentralize the way we think about decolonial. So when we do break them apart, pry them open, deconstruct them in some sense, it also becomes an interesting study of, I mean, clearly we're not just talking about the colonization of the mind only, because in these panels we're also discussing various institutional forms that they take that are sometimes reflexive of, if not a feedback loop with the colonization of the mind. So, Suheyla, the question here is that within the broader Arab world, the histories of colonialism from a state and geopolitical sense are very uneven, because some places were under colonial rule, some places were under settler colonial rule, which is very different from just a kind of colonial, I mean, well, there is also the protectorates, no? Colonial protectorates. Many countries were that. Many of the North African countries were settler colonial, but many of the Arab, like the current Arab region, especially the Gulf, were protectorates. And then alongside that, there was also the imperial kind of tensions, which is different from the colonial ones, because, I mean, there was the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire and later American imperialism. So all of these kind of very different histories of occupation, which are also reflective of how institutions like shaped and crafted how to represent art and culture and the people of these places. So when I look at, say, the Islamic Biennale that happens in Saudi Arabia, it feels actually like a new form of Orientalism. Like it's a neo-Orientalist project on the one hand, which is, I mean, almost like an Orientalism 2.0. You know, it's like we'll show it better if we do it over here. So I wonder if I know that in Barjeel you're very sensitive to these questions, Sultan, yourself, all the colleagues, because I can see that there is a de-Orientalizing of Arab art history in the way it's shown, in the way it's framed. But are these questions that happen among you and your colleagues or the thinkers you're in conversation with, which differentiate Orientalist pasts and how they shape museums, colonial pasts, sometimes which coincide, and imperial pasts, because all of them had their own display techniques, their own knowledge, tools, and technologies. So are these differentiations also factored in when discussing museum building?
Thank you, Sabi. That's a very nuanced question, and you're absolutely right. The dynamics of the power dynamics within the broader region have been variegated and kind of also layered in many ways, with settler colonialism sometimes being part of imperialism and so forth. And of course, as you mentioned, this history of the protectorates is a very challenging subject as well to speak about from the perspective of it being a colonial presence, right? You know, there's still a lot of sensitivity around that. In the context of Barjeel, you know, you sort of know our the foundation a little more closely than maybe some people in the audience, and you know that our team is quite small, and then that really enables us to be very informal with each other. So our days really begin with an hour of just chats amongst each other. So perhaps it is just that allows us to be a little bit more kind of sensitive to how to position things, and much of it also comes from, you know, just our personalities within the team. So in thinking of how to present histories, we might not have, you know, kind of made formal distinctions amongst, you know, an Orientalist presentation versus a colonial one, and so forth, and how do we rethink that? But through just ongoing informal conversations, just, you know, chats with each other, like we're always talking to each other, that I think helps us to be more sensitive, where we sometimes come back and rethink just things like labels. You know, do we say Iraqi or born in Baghdad? for instance. And that comes up in conversation like 3 times before we print the label. And so I would say that it happens a little bit more organically, and perhaps we could benefit from a little more structure, but I think that also helps us be so agile and respond to kind of the nuances of individual artists.
Yeah, thank you for that, Suheyla. But Meera, if you permit us, we should take some questions from the audience, and I did see 2 hands raised at the back. Yeah, 2 questions from the audience. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. So my question is not really a question, it's more of a comment leading from...
we can't see you, could you just stand up perhaps?
Stand up?
Yeah, we can't see you.
Okay, now everyone can see me. Okay, so leading from Shukla's question about museums being colonial structures, I just want to say that I'm a curator by training, by practice, and now by employment. And in my understanding, I've just written this down, so I just want to read it. Museums today in the global south are foundationally decolonial because they are museums we work at, we talk about them, we own them. Of course, museum collections are always owned by the rich and powerful, either by very privileged people within the state or by capitalist leaders of industry. But that is a problem of the capitalist system of the art world as a whole, not the contemporary museum ecosystem. The teachings in curatorial practice that come from the West subjugate us, saying curators are colonial. We are not. Curators in the global south should not be put in the same box as someone from the British Museum or an equivalent. Not only should the narrative not guide us, but we should actively reject that narrative. Are museums colonial? They're colonial in the same way that eating with a spoon is colonial. But what do we eat, where do we eat, and how do we eat that food?
Yeah, thank you for that comment. So it is more in the nature of a comment. Does anyone want to respond to that? Yeah, can we take the second question as well, please?
Yeah, so my question is, I actually like to flag one thing. Okay, so we are talking about the decolonization of mind, and we are talking about the right-wing apparatus, and there, like the Anita Dubey mentioned about the apparatus, how they form this kind of Hindutva through different form. So also I would like to just to flag off one thing that in the recent book that by Mirananda in Post-Colonial Theory and Making Hindu Nationalism, The Wages of Unreason, that she argues that decolonization of mind, that certain strands of post-colonial and decolonial thought may unintentionally enable majoritarian appropriation by critiquing Enlightenment rationality. How might we critically engage this claim from within the left itself, especially in terms of how concepts like civilizational epistemologies are mobilized without collapsing into either relativism or of a defense of universalism as a purely Western? So that's the question is. I hope I clear myself.
Would you like to respond?
Sure. Very heavy questions raised. I want to club a few together. I want to take your point very seriously about the museum being a colonial space, yet finding space for representation for several marginalized communities. I also want to speak to your point about how museums in the global south are, in your words, decolonial. But I want to go back to Savi's point and say, what does it mean to reject these vocabularies that have often become lazy shorthand, right? The museum is decolonial. No, it's colonial. Let's deal with it. I don't think that's a bad thing, right? The museum being a colonial structure is not a bad thing when you consider that colonial structures gave caste minorities more rights than the structures that came before them, right? They did not give others those rights, and so you have to engage with the structure of the colonial in a particular way. But you have to engage with the colonial as a form, rather than seeing it as is sort of dissimilar forms to other forms that exist alongside it, right? So in fact, the colonial in some ways is like the reoriental. I don't mind the reorientalization because it's orientalization. I'd like to critique it as a form as robustly as I critique the colonial, right? I am tired of decolonial becoming shorthand for evolved or better or fixed, which is precisely where we've landed, unfortunately, where we consider that the process of decoloniality ends with non-colonial bodies being in the room, when in reality, the sort of conversations that take place in these museums, the conversations that happen here, are mediated by caste, class, religion, gender, and sexuality, right? So how do we acknowledge these things, not as a way of dismissing them or the products that get created, but instead towards forming a more robust sort of critique that sheds the easy decoloniality that I fear has become a catch-all phrase to avoid any productive work towards accountability, but certainly towards newer imaginations.
Suheyla, would you like to comment on that?
Sure. I mean, I agree, Anish. I mean, I think it's a far more exciting prospect as well to actually think of how can we move forward in a productive and constructive way rather than kind of regurgitating this problem with the past. I also, reflecting on this question of a museum, it's true, it is a colonial structure, an invention, and yet it serves a purpose. And I think in thinking of how do we use that in actually imagining a future is a little more exciting than just dismissing it because it didn't emerge from a particular region or a particular structure. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Suheyla, and thank you, Anish, for your interventions. And I think we'll close the session for now, and there are more conversations to be had in the afternoon.